On a quiet Tuesday afternoon in January 1867, in the middle of London's Regent's Park, around 500 people were skating on a frozen lake when the ice beneath them simply gave way. Within moments, some 200 men, women and children were in the water, in front of an audience of 2,000 people watching from the banks. 40 of them did not go home that evening. There was no storm that day. There was no sudden freak of weather, no lightning crack from the sky, no warning bell that failed to ring. There was only a lake that had already broken once, only a day before, and a decision made by ordinary men doing an ordinary job to leave it exactly as it was. This is the story of the Regent's Park skating disaster, one of the worst civilian accidents in London's history, and today one of its most completely forgotten. To understand how an afternoon of ice skating in one of the most fashionable parks in England became a mass drowning watched by thousands, you first have to go back to the world that lake belonged to, and to the warning that came and went unheeded less than 24 hours before. Before we go on, this channel is only just getting started, and stories like this one are exactly what it is built around. The histories of Britain that never made it into the school books. If that is something you would like more of, take a moment to subscribe so the next one reaches you. And tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching this from. To understand what happened on the Ornamental Water on the 15th of January 1867, you first have to understand what Regent's Park was and what it meant to the people of London. The park had not existed a lifetime earlier. It was the creation of the architect John Nash, laid out from 1811 onward at the wish of the Prince Regent, after whom it took its name, and it had grown through the 1820s, 30s and 40s from a private royal enclosure into something the ordinary population of London could actually walk through, sit in and use. By the 1860s it was ringed by white stucco terraces, grand and new, home to the professional and moneyed classes of Marylebone and St John's Wood, and it drew visitors from every part of the city, not merely its immediate neighbours. It was, in the language of the age, a place of resort, somewhere a clerk from the city and a gentleman from Mayfair might, for one afternoon, stand on the same patch of ground. At the western side of the park lay the Ornamental Water, an artificial lake, serpentine in shape, dug and shaped as part of Nash's original design. In summer, it carried pleasure boats, rented out by the hour to courting couples and family parties. In a hard winter, when the frost held long enough, it became something else entirely, one of the most popular open-air skating grounds in the whole of London. Skating on the Ornamental Water was not a rare treat reserved for the wealthy. It was, when the ice came, remarkably democratic. Labourers, who might never otherwise set foot inside the park's more genteel corners, came to skate alongside tradesmen, clerks, and the sons of gentlemen. Where a crowd gathered, trade followed it, and among the crowd on the 14th and 15th of January 1867 were two men who earned their living from exactly that kind of gathering. James Griffin was 29 years old and lived on Drury Lane, and on the ice at Regent's Park he sold oranges to the skaters and to the onlookers who lined the banks. Not far from him worked John Bryan, who carried a small portable stove out onto the frozen ground and roasted chestnuts to sell to the same crowd. Neither man was there to skate. They were there because a large, cheerful crowd on a cold day was good for business, exactly as it would have been on any other hard winter since the lake was dug. There was nothing unusual about their presence that week. That, in itself, is worth holding on to. This was not a special occasion, a fair or a festival. It was simply Tuesday. The lake itself was the responsibility of the Office of Works, the government department charged with the upkeep of the royal parks, headed at this time by Lord John Manners, first Commissioner of Works. Beneath that layer of political responsibility sat the men who did the actual daily labour of maintaining the park. The keepers whose duties included the care of the wildfowl that lived on the Ornamental Water year-round, ducks and other birds that needed open water, even when the surface elsewhere had frozen hard. There was no statutory authority responsible for the safety of ice on a London park lake in 1867. No inspector, no licensing body, no government office whose sole task was to decide whether a sheet of ice was fit to carry the weight of hundreds of skaters. What safety provision existed was informal, and it rested largely on a loose network of park attendants, sometimes called icemen, often connected to the Royal Humane Society, the charitable body that had spent the better part of a century developing equipment and expertise for pulling people from cold water. Ropes, ladders, wooden drags, and cork lifebuoys were kept at hand near popular skating grounds, and attendants were posted to watch the ice and to act when it failed, because everyone involved understood that, in a hard winter, it eventually would. That understanding was not theoretical. The Ornamental Water already had a history of giving way in previous cold spells, which is precisely why icemen were stationed there at all. The lake had earned that caution once already, before this particular winter began. On the 14th of January, 1867, it earned it again. That afternoon, with the frost still holding, the ice cracked and gave way beneath a portion of the crowd, and 21 people went into the water. Every single one of them was pulled out alive. The attendants did their job. The equipment worked. Nobody died. It would be difficult to construct a clearer warning than that. 21 people in the water in a single afternoon is not a rumour passed along by word of mouth days later. It was witnessed by the crowd on the banks, reported in the following morning's press, and known in specific terms to the men responsible for the park. The ice on the Ornamental Water had just demonstrated, in the most direct way possible, that it could not be trusted to hold the weight being placed upon it. And yet, when the sun rose on the 15th of January, nothing had changed. The lake was not closed. No notice went up warning skaters away. The frost continued through the night, and by the standards of anyone watching the sky rather than the ice itself, conditions looked, if anything, more settled than the day before. There was, however, one change on the ice itself, and it went in the wrong direction. Along the edges of the lake and around its small islands, where the wildfowl needed clear water, the park keepers had broken the ice by hand. This was routine maintenance, done for the birds, and it had almost certainly been done before the near disaster of the 14th, just as it was done again before the 15th. Its effect, though, was to strip away exactly the feature that might have made a second collapse survivable, a shallow broken margin at the lake's rim, through which a skater thrown into the water could scramble to safety in a foot or two of water rather than being pitched into the open lake itself. Nobody weighed that decision against the warning of the day before. Nobody, so far as any surviving record shows, connected the maintenance of the edges with the safety of the centre. The keepers who broke that edge ice are not named in any account that survives. They were, in every sense that matters to this story, simply doing their job, the same job they always did, on a day like any other. That is what makes the decision so unsettling in hindsight. It required no malice and no unusual carelessness. It required only the absence of anyone whose job it was to ask whether yesterday's near catastrophe changed anything about today. By the middle of the day on the 15th of January, the frost that had held for the best part of a week had drawn a crowd even larger than the one that had broken the ice less than 24 hours earlier. Word of yesterday's dip had spread, and rather than frightening people away, it appeared to have done the opposite. Everyone had been pulled out alive. The lake, as far as the public understood it, had proven itself safe even under strain. By early afternoon, something in the region of 500 people were out on the ice at once, with a further 2,000 or so gathered along the banks to watch them, a larger gathering, by far, than the one the lake had carried the day before. James Griffin worked his way among them with his tray of oranges. John Bryan tended his chestnut stove, the smoke curling up over skaters, gliding past in their Sunday best. Though it was a Tuesday, families stood at the water's edge. Children who had begged to be brought had got their wish. Mr. Wenzel, the proprietor of the lake's pleasure boats, was there as he always was, his boats drawn up at the edge, waiting for the thaw that would put them back to their usual summer use. For now they sat idle, though before the day was out they would become something else entirely, the only rescue craft available on a lake suddenly full of drowning people. By roughly 3:30 in the afternoon, observers on the banks began to notice that the ice no longer looked the way it had that morning. Contemporary accounts describe it plainly. There was, by this point, not a sound piece of ice, more than a foot or so across anywhere on the surface. What had held as a single sheet was now a mosaic of cracks, seams and weak patches, invisible from a distance, but readily apparent to anyone standing close. Some skaters noticed. A number left the ice in those final minutes, a few of them getting, in the words of one contemporary account, a wetting in getting out of danger, soaked to the knee or worse as they scrambled for the bank. It was a warning. It was seen. It did not stop the afternoon, and it did not clear the lake. At around 3:30, without any further warning that those on the ice could act upon, the ice along the banks came loose and drew away from the edge. Within moments, the fracture spread. The main sheet of ice, weakened by days of freeze and thaw and stripped of its shallow margin by the keeper's own hands, gave way across a wide stretch of the lake. Within seconds, close to 200 people who had been standing or gliding across that stretch dropped through it, into water that at its deepest point ran to 12 feet, far over the head of every man, woman and child who went in. There was no single crash, no single point of collapse. Witnesses on the bank described it as the ice giving way in patches across a wide front, so that people who had been skating within arm's reach of one another went into the water at different moments, in different places, some together, some entirely alone. The 2,000 or so spectators lining the bank saw it happen in full, in daylight, at a distance of only a few dozen yards. There was no smoke, no wreckage, nothing to obscure the view. It happened in the open, in front of everyone, which is part of what made it so difficult, afterwards, for London to look away from. Those still on solid ice scattered towards the banks. Some of that ice held, some of it did not, and gave way beneath the very people fleeing it, adding fresh gaps to the ones already torn open. For a short time, nobody on the banks could say with any confidence how many people remained in the water and how many had reached safety, because the surface itself was still breaking, unpredictably, in places nobody could have marked in advance. The cold acted quickly. A person thrown suddenly into water at that temperature loses strength and coordination within a matter of minutes, long before exhaustion or the depth of the lake could finish the work alone. Some who went in close to the widening gaps were able to grip the broken edge of the ice, only to have it crumble again under their weight as they tried to pull themselves clear. Others were pulled under the unbroken ice nearby, out of sight of the banks entirely, which is part of why so many bodies were not recovered that same afternoon. Mr. Wenzel reached his boats within moments of the ice giving way and rowed directly into the gap, pulling survivors over the gunwale as fast as he and those helping him could manage. Moore, the same man who'd been given a medal some 2 years before for an earlier rescue on the ice, was, in the words of one contemporary account, very active, working the water again and again to bring people out. Onlookers on the bank tore branches from the park's trees, anything with enough length to be thrust out across open water towards a hand that might still be reaching for it. By 3:30 that afternoon, in front of 2,000 witnesses, the lake that had spared every one of the 21 people who fell into it the day before did not spare everyone this time. 40 of those who went into the water on the 15th of January 1867 did not come out of it alive. The work of pulling the living from the water did not end when the immediate panic did. Boats that had sat idle through the winter were now the only means of reaching people still struggling in open water beyond the reach of any branch or rope thrown from the bank, and Wenzel's small fleet went out again and again, each return trip adding survivors to a growing crowd of soaked, shivering people gathered on the grass. Dr. Ober, a surgeon attached to the Royal Humane Society, was on hand to treat those pulled out alive, working among the crowd on the bank rather than in any hospital, because for many of the survivors the danger did not end the moment they were lifted from the water. Cold of that severity can kill quietly, hours after a person has been declared safe, and the surgeon's task that afternoon was as much about watching the living as it was about anything else. Police were drawn to the park within minutes, among them Inspector Burrows and Inspector Hines, whose task quickly became one of managing a crowd that could not disperse. 2,000 people had watched the ice give way, and very few of them left the scene once the rescues began. Some stayed to search the faces of survivors for their own relatives. Others stayed simply because they had seen something they could not process quickly enough to walk away from. As dusk came down over the park, it became clear that not everyone who had gone into the water that afternoon was going to be found by nightfall. The ice, which had broken apart in the collapse, began to knit itself back together as the temperature dropped again after dark, closing over sections of the lake that still held bodies beneath it. Recovery work that evening was slow, and by the following night, the 16th of January, 33 of the eventual 40 who had died had been brought out of the water. The remainder would take longer still, because the lake had, in effect, sealed itself shut again over what it had taken. Marylebone Workhouse became the point where the recovered dead were brought, identified, and claimed. Mr. Douglas, the workhouse master, oversaw a task that had nothing routine about it, despite the ordinary setting. Relatives were brought through, row by row, to look at faces they knew. One father, brought in to identify his son, was recorded saying that he could not be dead, that he had only left him 2 hours before, strong and cheerful. It is a small sentence spoken by a man who did not yet fully believe what he was being asked to confirm, and it survives in the press record of that night, precisely because everyone in the room understood exactly what he meant. A contemporary account of the scene at the workhouse called it melancholy in the extreme, and described the identifications producing, again and again, a piercing shriek from those brought through to look. By the time the recovery work was done, 29 of the 34 bodies so far brought out had been identified by name, among them Griffin the orange seller and Brian, whose portable chestnut stove was recovered from the lake bed alongside him. Among the dead were also 2 children, Charles Jukes, aged 9, and John Broadbridge, aged 10, along with Thomas Harvey the younger, 18 years old, and from Leeds, a young man named Woodhouse of Bedford House in Tavistock Square, only 17, and others whose addresses ran from Highbury Crescent to Sherborne Street, an ordinary cross-section of London households, none of them connected to one another, except by an afternoon spent on the same sheet of ice. An inquest opened on the 16th of January at Marylebone Workhouse, before Edwin Lancaster, coroner for Central Middlesex, in the same building where the identifications had taken place, only hours before. 29 names had already been confirmed by the time the coroner sat, and the proceedings were adjourned to allow further evidence to be gathered, resuming on the 19th and taking formal testimony from the 21st of January onward. What emerged in that testimony went well beyond a simple account of ice giving way in cold weather. Witnesses confirmed, under oath, what had already been suspected from the state of the lake that afternoon, that park workmen had deliberately broken the ice around the islands and along the banks in the days before the 15th, in order to keep open water available for the wildfowl that lived there through the winter. This was not disputed. It was not offered as an accusation to be argued down. It was simply stated as a fact of how the lake had been maintained, and it went directly to the question the coroner's jury had been asked to consider: why so many people who fell through the ice had found no shallow margin to scramble to, and instead had gone straight into water, deep enough to close over an adult standing at full height. Alongside that evidence sat the plainer, harder fact of the 14th of January, the 21 people who had gone into the same lake a day earlier and been pulled out without a single loss of life. That episode was known to the jury, known to the coroner, and known, it must be said, to the wider public reading the newspapers that week, because it had already been reported once before this second, far graver collapse. The question hanging over the inquest was not whether the danger had been foreseeable. By any reasonable measure, it plainly had been. The question was who, if anyone, would be held to account for what had been allowed to happen next. On the 21st of January, 1867, the jury returned its verdict: accidental death in all 40 cases. No park keeper was named, no official of the Office of Works was singled out, despite testimony that established in plain terms that the lake's own custodians had stripped away the one feature that might have turned catastrophe into inconvenience. The formal finding of the law was that nobody bore responsibility for what had happened. It was, in the language of the verdict, simply an accident, the kind that visits without warning and without a human hand behind it, even though the record built during the inquest itself told a rather different story to anyone reading it closely. The jury did not leave the matter entirely without consequence, however. Alongside its verdict, it issued a formal recommendation that the depth of the ornamental water be reduced, so that a body of water used for public recreation could no longer conceal, beneath an ordinary skin of ice, 12 feet of open water capable of swallowing a grown adult whole. It was the one substantive acknowledgement, however indirect, that the lake itself, and not merely bad fortune, had made this disaster possible. Lord John Manners, as First Commissioner of Works, agreed to carry the recommendation out, though he had played no part in the daily decisions that led to the 15th of January and was not, in any of the surviving testimony, treated as a man who needed to answer for them personally. Responsibility, in the end, settled nowhere. The lake would change. No person would. In the months that followed the verdict, the Office of Works set about carrying out the one instruction the inquest had given it. Contractors drained the ornamental water, exposing a lake bed that had, for more than half a century, held the depth that made the 15th of January possible. That bed was reshaped, levelled, and lined with concrete, and when the lake was refilled, it held a maximum depth of roughly 4 feet, shallow enough, in the stated purpose of the work, that a person of adult stature might not be drowned there again. The work was recorded as complete by June of 1868, a little over a year after the 40 names had been read out at Marylebone Workhouse. There was no new statute passed in Parliament because of what happened at Regent's Park, no board of inspectors created, no licensing scheme for the ice of London's public lakes. Unlike the railway disasters and mining explosions of the same era, which forced new laws onto the statute book, this reform was narrower and more physical. One lake, reshaped so that it could never again do what it had done. It is a strange kind of legacy, a safety measure written not into an Act of Parliament, but into the very bed of the water itself, invisible to anyone who has not been told to look for it. And yet it endures. The ornamental water is still there today, in the same stretch of Regent's Park it has occupied since Nash first laid it out, still home to the wildfowl the keepers were protecting when they broke its edges in January of 1867. It is still used for boating, pedalos and rowing boats gliding across water that, unlike the water James Griffin and John Bryan worked beside that Tuesday afternoon, could not now close over an adult standing upright. Anyone who has ever paid for an hour on that lake, without a single thought as to why the water barely reaches their knees when they trail a hand over the side, has been floating on the direct physical answer to what happened there. No plaque marks the spot. No annual service is held on the 15th of January to remember the 40 people who died. No marker along the paths that ring the lake to tell a visitor what the ground beneath their feet once witnessed. Writers who have gone looking for the story since have tended to describe it accurately as one of London's forgotten disasters, a catastrophe substantial enough to have been the worst weather-related accident in the country's history at the time it happened, and yet absent from the city's popular memory in a way that disasters with active memorial cultures are not. That contrast is worth sitting with for a moment longer. A colliery explosion in this same era might leave behind a named memorial, a chapel plaque, a village that still marks the date every year without needing to be reminded why. Regent's Park offers nothing of the kind, not because the loss of life was smaller, but because the setting itself worked against remembrance. A mining village loses its own. The grief has a fixed address, a chapel, a row of cottages where everyone knew everyone who did not come home. A London park draws its crowd from across an entire city and disperses it again by evening, so that the 40 households touched by the 15th of January 1867 were scattered from Drury Lane to Islington to Tavistock Square, never forming the kind of single bounded community that keeps a local memory alive from one generation to the next. The newspapers of the week did their part. The Times and the Illustrated London News both carried substantial accounts of the collapse and its aftermath, and the story travelled as far as Harper's Weekly in America, carried across the Atlantic as a notable London catastrophe within days of the ice giving way. For a fortnight or so, it was, by the standards of the age, a story every literate household in the country might have encountered in one form or another. Then the coverage receded, as coverage of any single week's news eventually does, and without a fixed place, a fixed date of remembrance, or a bereaved community large enough to keep insisting on it, the story receded with it. What is left physically is only the lake itself, and the shallow water within it, which every visitor who's ever stepped into a pedalo there has unknowingly relied upon without being told why it is there. The bed beneath their feet is the only monument the disaster ever received, laid down not in bronze or stone, but in concrete and levelled earth, doing its quiet work more than a century and a half after the jury that ordered it sat in a Marylebone workhouse and could not bring itself to name a single person responsible for what had happened only days before. The concrete bed, laid in 1868, has needed maintenance and partial renewal more than once across the century and a half since, as any structure holding back London clay and standing water eventually does. But its governing measurement, a depth of a little over a metre at most, has never been allowed to creep back toward what it was before. Anyone who wished to check this for themselves need only step to the edge of the lake today. A person standing waist-deep in the shallows near the bank is in most places close to standing on the bottom, a fact so ordinary to a modern visitor that it never occurs to them to ask why. The islands that gave the wildfowl their refuge are still there too, low green humps rising out of the water, still home to ducks, geese and herons, much as they were in 1867, still requiring the same basic maintenance that once meant clearing ice from their margins in the depths of a hard winter. The birds in that sense got exactly the daily care they had always been given, and it was never their needs that were in question that January, only the judgment of when and how that care was carried out. Nash's terraces still stand around the park's edges too, weathered and restored across successive generations, but recognisably the same white stucco frontages that overlooked the crowd gathering on the ice that Tuesday afternoon, giving a visitor today roughly the same skyline that the 2,000 people on the bank would have seen as they watched the lake give way. The park has grown busier since, its paths better lit, its railings sturdier, its management passed through generations of civil servants who never had reason to think about ice at all, because the one lake in London that had already proven, twice within a single day, that it could not be trusted with the old depth had been permanently altered to make sure it never had to prove it a third time. What survives of the 40 names lost that day survives almost entirely on paper, in the digitized pages of 19th century newspapers that a family historian might now stumble across while searching for an entirely different ancestor. A descendant of the Broadbridge family, or of the Harveys of Leeds, tracing a branch of the family tree back through the 1860s, might find a 10-year-old boy or an 18-year-old young man ending abruptly in the same week in January, with no explanation beyond a newspaper column reporting a skating accident in a London park, and no memorial to visit that would tell them any more than that. For most families touched by the 15th of January, that single newspaper record, held now in an archive rather than a family Bible, is the only trace their relative's death left behind at all. It is a peculiar kind of survival, a disaster remembered almost exclusively through the same institutions that reported it in the first place, the Times and the Illustrated London News among them, their coverage outlasting any physical memorial by a full century and more. Where a mining disaster leaves a memorial garden or a lifeboat disaster leaves a named vessel, the Regent's Park skating disaster left newsprint, an inquest transcript, and a lake that quietly does its work without ever explaining itself to the people using it. Every fact recovered about that January afternoon, the number on the ice, the number pulled from the water alive the day before, the names read out at Marylebone Workhouse, comes down to us now only because a handful of Victorian reporters thought it worth writing down in detail, and because those pages were kept. It is worth noting that Wenzel's boats had almost certainly sat at that same mooring on the 14th of January as well. On the afternoon, the ice first gave way, and every one of those 21 people was hauled out alive. If so, the same boatman who spent that first afternoon shepherding people to safety in what became, by the standards of the day, a story with a happy ending, was back at his post barely 24 hours later, rowing into a second collapse that this time overwhelmed the margin between near miss and catastrophe. No document credits him by name for what happened on the 14th, only for what happened on the 15th. But the boats did not move, the mooring did not change, and the man responsible for them had no reason to expect that the second day would look nothing like the first. That absence of expectation runs through nearly everyone connected to this story, from the keepers who broke the edge ice as they always did, to the crowd that returned larger than before because the previous day had ended without loss, to the coroner's jury that could describe 40 deaths as accidental despite hearing, in the same sitting, evidence of a decision that had made those deaths more likely. Nothing about the 15th of January, 1867, required extraordinary bad luck. It required only that everyone involved carry on exactly as they had the day before, on a lake that had already shown, in the clearest terms available to it, that it could no longer be trusted to behave the same way twice. The Royal Humane Society itself deserves a word here, since it was the Society's network that stood behind Moore's earlier medal and behind the ropes, ladders and cork buoys kept ready at the water's edge. That January, founded in the previous century for the express purpose of reviving people pulled from the water more or less dead, the Society had built up by the 1860s a system of receiving houses at London's most popular stretches of open water, places where a person hauled out cold and unresponsive could be carried in and worked over by trained attendants using methods of resuscitation that were, by the standards of the age, genuinely advanced. Hyde Park's Serpentine had one. So, in effect, did the network of icemen and stewards who watched over Regent's Park's Ornamental Water, though the apparatus available to them on the 15th of January was overwhelmed by a scale of collapse. The system had not been built to answer all at once. 21 people in the water, spread across an afternoon, was within the Society's ordinary competence, and it had proven so only the day before. 200 people in the water, within moments of one another, was a different order of event entirely, And no receiving house, no rope, no medal-winning boatman, however active, could answer for all of them at once. That gap between what the Society's apparatus could manage and what the 15th of January actually demanded of it is itself part of why the lake's own depth mattered so much to the jury that examined the disaster afterward. Rescue equipment can only do so much when the water beneath the ice runs to 12 feet, and the crowd above it numbers in the hundreds. A shallower lake asks less of every rope, every drag, and every volunteer boatman standing ready at its edge, which is precisely the reasoning that led the coroner's jury to recommend altering the one variable that lay entirely within the Office of Work's own power to change. The story of the Regent's Park Lake did not stay confined to Regent's Park either. In the winters that followed, whenever a hard frost drew crowds onto other stretches of ornamental water across Britain's parks and public grounds, the events of January 1867 were the reference point invoked by the cautious. The example reached for whenever a keeper or a local council debated whether to let a crowd of that size out onto ice of an uncertain thickness. It became, in the absence of any national law, a kind of informal case study passed from one park authority to the next, proof that a lake which had survived one afternoon intact could still fail catastrophically on the very next, and that popularity and apparent safety were not the same thing. Where legislation never followed, caution sometimes did, borrowed second hand from a disaster most of the people exercising it could not have named. That borrowed caution is, in its own way, as real a legacy as the concrete bed beneath the ornamental water, even though it left no plaque and no statute behind it either. It survived in the working memory of park keepers and local officials for a generation or two after the event itself had begun to fade from the newspapers, carried forward not by monument but by professional caution, the kind that is rarely written down and rarely credited to the disaster that first taught it, yet which nonetheless traces back, however faintly, to one lake in London and one afternoon in January. It helps to understand exactly what makes a sheet of Park Lake ice unsafe, in a way that has nothing to do with how thick it looks from the bank. Ice that forms in a single hard freeze, uninterrupted, sets as one continuous crystal structure, strong enough at a reasonable thickness to bear the weight of hundreds of people moving across it. But the frost that produced the ice on the ornamental water that January had not been a single, unbroken freeze. It had come in a run of cold days interrupted, as English winters usually are, by brief thaws, moments where the surface temperature crept back up, softened the top layer, and then dropped again overnight to refreeze it. Each of those cycles left a seam, a place where new ice had bonded imperfectly to old, a hairline weakness, invisible from above, but real all the way through the sheet. Repeat that cycle across a week or more, and what a skater experiences as one continuous gleaming surface is, underneath, something closer to a great many overlapping patches, stitched together at their edges rather than fused as one. It can carry weight perfectly well right up until the moment a crack finds its way from one seam to the next, at which point the failure does not stay local. It runs. That is the mechanism that produced the description given by observers on the bank in the last half hour before the collapse. The sense that there was no sound piece of ice more than a foot or so across anywhere on the lake. It did not mean the ice looked broken. It meant that beneath an unbroken-looking surface, the seams had multiplied to the point where almost no single patch of ice was still bonded firmly to its neighbours on every side. A skater gliding across it that afternoon would have felt nothing different underfoot from the day before. The difference was invisible until the instant it was not. This is also why the loss of the shallow edge mattered so much more than it might have on a lake with a different shape. On many stretches of ornamental water, the margins slope gradually, so that even where the ice fails, a person going through near the bank drops only a foot or two before their feet find solid ground. It is unpleasant, cold and undignified, but rarely fatal. The keeper's habit of breaking the edge ice for the wildfowl removed that shallow zone as a place of safety altogether, since the ice there had already been cleared away entirely, leaving open water rather than a thin breakable crust. A skater fleeing the centre of the lake as the ice gave way beneath their feet had, in many places, nowhere shallow left to reach. The edge that should have caught them had already been taken out of the equation days, if not weeks, before the 15th of January ever arrived. The ordinary rituals of a Victorian skating afternoon are worth setting out in their own right, because they explain why so many people who had no connection to one another ended up on the same stretch of ice at the same hour. Skating in a London park in this period was not an activity that required specialist equipment beyond a pair of skates, generally iron blades screwed or strapped onto the sole of an ordinary boot, available cheaply enough that the pastime was not restricted to those who could afford dedicated sporting dress. Men skated in their everyday coats and hats. Women skated in long winter dresses, weighted at the hem against the wind, a fashion that, incidentally, made a sudden plunge into freezing water even more dangerous than it would otherwise have been, since sodden wool and heavy skirts drag a person down and slow every attempt to kick free. Boys who had begged an afternoon off from an apprenticeship or a schoolroom brought whatever blades the family owned. Often a single pair passed between brothers over successive winters. The sound of an afternoon like this would have carried a good distance across the water and the surrounding grass. The scrape and hiss of blades cutting across the surface. Laughter. The calls of vendors like Griffin advertising his oranges and Brian his chestnuts over the general noise of the crowd. And beneath all of it, unnoticed by nearly everyone present, the occasional low groan of ice, settling and shifting under load, as sound skaters of the period had long since learned to treat as background rather than warning, because ice groans constantly under weight without necessarily being on the point of failure. That familiarity, built up over a week of skating on ice that groaned and held, is itself part of why so few people that final afternoon reacted to a sound that, on any other day, would have meant nothing at all. By early afternoon, the crowd along the banks had begun to take on a distinct shape of its own, layered by class and habit in a way that would have been obvious to anyone standing back and watching rather than skating. Nearer the boathouse, where Wenzel's idle craft sat drawn up out of the water, groups of better-dressed spectators gathered to watch rather than skate, content to observe the spectacle from a safe distance in coats better suited to standing still than to exercise. Further round, where the ice met the paths used by ordinary foot traffic through the park, stood the kind of crowd that had simply been passing and stopped, drawn in by the noise and the novelty of hundreds of people gliding across frozen water in the middle of London. Griffin worked this second crowd hardest, moving along the bank with his tray rather than out onto the ice itself, calling his oranges to skaters pausing at the rail to catch their breath, and to spectators who fancied something to eat while they watched. An orange in January was not a casual purchase for a labouring family, and the trade tells its own small story about the crowd that day, a mixture of people with a spare penny or two to enjoy an afternoon's entertainment, and people who had come simply because admission to the spectacle cost nothing at all. Brian, a little further along, kept his stove going steadily. The smell of roasting chestnuts, a fixture of any cold afternoon in a London park, familiar enough that nobody would have given it a second thought. No more remarkable that day than on any other frozen Tuesday that winter. Among the skaters themselves were people who had clearly come prepared for a proper afternoon of it, rather than a passing look. Men in skating clubs practicing figures near the centre of the lake, where the ice ran clearest, younger and less experienced skaters keeping closer to the banks where a stumble carried less embarrassment, and a scattering of children, among them Charles Jukes and John Broadbridge, weaving between the adults with the particular fearlessness of boys who'd been given an afternoon of freedom and intended to make the most of it. Neither boy could have known that the ice holding his weight so easily that afternoon was, in exactly the sense already described, a patchwork rather than a single sound sheet, stitched together by seams that had been quietly weakening for days. As 3 o'clock came and went, nothing yet distinguished this particular afternoon from the one before it. The crowd had simply grown larger, drawn by clear skies, a continuing hard frost, and the reassurance, whether anyone said it aloud or not, that yesterday's dip had ended in 21 soaked but living skaters, rather than a single death. It was, by every outward measure available to the people standing on it, the safest the ice had looked all week. Somewhere among that afternoon crowd stood the attendants, whose task it was to watch the ice itself, rather than skate on it, the same icemen and stewards whose ropes, ladders and cork buoys had done their work so effectively less than a day before. Their post that afternoon was not a formal one in any legal sense. Nothing in statute told them how large a crowd was too large, or how many hours of frost were enough to trust a lake that had cracked open only the previous day. Their judgment rested on experience rather than regulation, on having watched this particular stretch of ice through enough winters to develop a feel for it that no rulebook could have written down for them. That experience told them, on the 15th of January, to keep their equipment close rather than to close the lake outright, a judgment that had been perfectly sound the day before, and would prove fatally mistaken within the hour. There was no mechanism available to them, had they wanted one, to bar 500 people from a public park lake on a clear, cold afternoon. They could watch and stand ready to pull people from the water when it failed in the ordinary, survivable way it usually did. What they could not do, because no one in the whole chain of authority above them had given them the power to do it, was tell the crowd that the lake itself was no longer the lake it had been a day earlier, patched together now by seams that had multiplied past the point their experience could reliably judge. It is worth remembering that these were not careless men. They had proved as much on the 14th, working quickly and effectively to bring 21 people out alive. Their failure, if it can be called that, was a failure built into the position they had been given rather than a failure of nerve or attention on the day itself. They were watching the right lake, standing in the right place, holding the right equipment, and still it would not be enough, because the change that mattered, the multiplying of cracks beneath an unbroken-looking surface, was not something their ropes and drags were built to prevent. They were built only to answer for it, after the fact, one skater at a time, and on the 15th of January, the lake asked more of them at once than any rope or ladder, however quickly deployed, could answer for. The verdict returned at Marylebone that January was not, in truth, an unusual one for its era. Coroners' juries across mid-Victorian Britain returned findings of accidental death in case after case where a modern courtroom might have pressed much harder on questions of institutional negligence, whether the disaster in question was a factory machine left unguarded, a railway signal box undermanned, or a park lake left open the day after it had already proved unsafe. The legal concept of corporate or institutional responsibility, the idea that a department or an office, rather than a single identifiable person, might be held to answer for a death, barely existed in any usable form in English law at this date. A jury could establish, in scrupulous detail, exactly what had gone wrong and exactly which practice had made it worse, and still have no proper legal mechanism available to translate that finding into blame resting anywhere beyond the vague, unprosecutable expanse of the Office of Works. This is not offered as an excuse for what happened at Regent's Park, only as an explanation for why the pattern repeated itself so often across the era, in one Victorian inquiry after another. A jury could hear evidence, as this one did, that keepers had broken the ice around the islands, that no closure had followed a warning as serious as 21 people going into the water the day before, and could still find no legal path to translate that evidence into consequence for any individual. The men who had made those decisions returned to their ordinary duties once the inquest closed, tending the same wildfowl on the same lake. Their names never recorded because no one in the process had either the will or the legal tool to ask for them. This gap between what an inquest could establish and what it could actually punish was not lost on observers at the time either. Commentary in the press that followed the verdict noted the peculiar shape of the outcome, evidence of a clear and specific institutional failure sitting alongside a formal finding that assigned no blame to anyone at all, and treated it less as scandal than as simply how such matters were handled. There was no public outcry demanding prosecutions, no petition calling for the keepers to be named and disciplined. The jury's recommendation about the lake's depth was, in the context of the era, already a comparatively assertive response, an inquest choosing to act on the practical lesson of the case even where the law gave it no way to act on the question of blame. That asymmetry, a system able to fix the physical conditions that caused a disaster while remaining structurally unable to fix accountability for it, runs through a great deal of Victorian public safety history beyond this single lake. Reform in this period tended to arrive as a specific, practical alteration, a depth reduced, a guard fitted, a signal added, rather than as a broader reckoning with who had allowed the danger to persist in the first place. Regent's Park received exactly that kind of reform, thorough in its physical effect and silent on the question of who, precisely, had left the lake open on the morning of the 15th of January after everything the 14th had already shown. The absence of blame did not mean the absence of consequence for the department involved, even if that consequence fell short of anything resembling punishment. The Office of Works carried out the jury's recommendation without public resistance, and in doing so effectively admitted, through action, if never through words, that its own arrangements had made the disaster possible. An admission of that kind, however quiet, however unaccompanied by any named individual stepping forward to answer for it, was itself unusual enough to be noted by those following the case closely, a rare instance of a Victorian public authority altering its own practice in direct response to a coroner's jury rather than simply absorbing the criticism and moving on unchanged. Among ordinary Londoners, too, the events of that January left a mark that outlasted the newspaper coverage itself, even without a plaque to formalise it. In the hard winters that came after, families who had once walked straight onto a frozen park lake at the first sign of thick ice grew noticeably more inclined to wait, to ask a keeper or consult a newspaper notice confirming the ice was considered safe before letting children out onto it unsupervised. It was an informal, unlegislated caution, learned the way most ordinary caution is learned, through a story passed from one household to another, rather than through any rule written down by an authority. A parent who had read the account of Charles Jukes or John Broadbridge, both no older than 10, going out onto ice that looked exactly as solid as any other winters, did not need a statute to make them think twice before allowing their own children the same freedom on the next hard frost. That kind of unwritten caution rarely survives as cleanly in the historical record as an Act of Parliament or a rebuilt lake bed, which is part of why it goes so easily unremarked when the story is told today. It leaves no clause to quote, no date of royal assent, no name of a minister who steered it through the House. It survived instead in the ordinary, largely undocumented judgment of parents and skaters who had simply heard what happened at Regent's Park and adjusted their own behaviour accordingly, a private, informal legacy running alongside the public, physical one that altered the lake itself, both tracing back to the same 40 names read out at Marylebone Workhouse in the third week of January 1867. On an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in January 1867, 500 people went skating on a lake in the middle of London, and 40 of them did not come home. There was no war that day. There was no earthquake, no storm, No act of God reaching down into a London park to take what it wanted. There was only a lake that had already broken once, only a day before, watched by the same keepers, crossed by the same crowd, left exactly as it was. The ornamental water still sits where it always has, ringed by the same white terraces, home to the same wildfowl the keepers were tending when they broke its edges that winter. It is shallow now, barely waist deep in most places, not because nature made it so, but because 40 deaths in one afternoon forced a lake to be rebuilt so that it never could happen again in quite that way. Every family who has ever rowed across it since, unaware of what lies beneath the water they are floating on, is resting on the one honest answer. This story ever received, even as the names of the people who might have prevented it were never written down at all. Griffin and Brian went out that morning to sell oranges and chestnuts to a crowd enjoying an ordinary winter's afternoon, exactly as they had the day before, and exactly as they expected to again. Charles Jukes was 9 years old, John Broadbridge was 10. Neither of them, nor 38 others who skated out onto that ice, believing it would hold, as it had held the day before, ever had the chance to learn otherwise, until it was already too late. 40 people, one afternoon, a lake that was never given the chance to fail like that again.